Let's kick our opening logo here. Come on. There we go. Clickety clacks, and welcome to Evolution Hour. Machinery, steampunk, all sorts of wacky crap. Typewriters. Remember clocks, analog? Wow. TortucanWordPress.com, my website, and away we go. We got another show in the works here on February 3rd, and the continuing saga of replacing Darwin, Nathaniel's extraordinary volume, whereby he seeks to obliterate the nasty Darwinian model. Unfortunately, I'm looking at the sources. So this particular episode continues with his chapter 5. He makes the rather imprudent option of bringing up developmental biology of embryos and dangles Neil Shubin's very well-known Your Inner Fish book, which I recommend everyone read. It's a wonderful one. There's also a video version of it, a 3-part thing that was done on PBS some years ago. Hello, Lisa. Hello. There we go. Hi. And any one of them, it's fine and dandy. Well, I'm going to be putting in some technical work on the philotypic stage. I will type that in here. The philotypic stage, which is the dreaded hourglass issue, the issue of how developmental biology splits in various lineages and starts very early. And there's a paper from 2014, and Kuratani, that Jensen makes a mistake of citing. So I want you to be able to look at that. And then there's also a 2006 paper on Tiktaalik that relates to Jensen's idea that he's okay with blended critters as transitionals, but not really Darwinian models. So it's a terrible thing. Mendes is probably the same thing. They accept the Big Bang isn't part of evolution. That is true only for young Earth creationists. If you look at old Earth creationists and intelligent design people, they're really fine with the Big Bang because that's the way they can hang all of their anthropic fine-tuning arguments on it, which requires standard physics to be the case. So the Big Bang cosmology is pretty much a dividing line for young Earth creationists, that if they're making a big deal out of that or radiometric dating, you're looking at a young Earth creationist. So those are diagnostic tools. Anyway, the developmental biology and origin of tetrapods and all that. Jackson, who, by the way, could not be here today. He was not working, but he's under the weather. He's got some strep throat, so he's sitting tidy, can't talk. And so I said, hunker down, kid, better. And I was going to invite dear Dan Stern Cardinale, but it's 3 hours later there in the East Coast, and he's got a baby and schools to teach and so forth and so on. So alas and alack, he figures in part 2 of the saga, which I will be putting the reference to before we're going on. Old Scratch says, blended critters like the platypus. Yeah, that's an interesting bit because the platypus is going to be coming in field on stuff that we're going to be dealing with in the second rocks volume, because they just now coming up with a full detailed genome analysis of the monotremes. And this is one where there's just been some dangling references in creationism land relating to it. That's all going to be relevant material to come up, because we are discussing the origin of a lot of different things and catching up to speed on the more recent technical literature that's come along since Rocks Volume 1. Lisa, oh, no, it's not strep. Yeah, everybody say hunker down. The last thing anybody wants on top of COVID is any other trouble. So everybody stay very, very careful on that. Part 2 of the show relates to Paul Price, Robert Carter, and John Sanford, who responded to the criticism of genetic entropy with a steadfast repetition of the claims. And that's at a creation.com paper that I'll be putting a link to in the video description after the show posts. And it happens to be Along the way, they cited peripherally just one actual technical paper, which was a 2009 paper by Gibbs on H1N1 origins, and I'll be putting a link to that one up. But of relevance to why I wanted Dan Stern Cardinale in here, Dan did a glorious video response to the Sanford Carter piece. And that one's up on YouTube. And it goes into all the reasons why that, nah, they don't have an argument. So, I also want to mention our patrons, just in case we have a screw up on the video signal. In the old days, when things were more reliable, I would wait until halfway through the show, and that just to be on the safe side, I want to get that out of the way. I want to thank our colleagues, Hendrel, Colton, Eric Ali, Suris, Zeshi, our researcher levels, Travis Adams, Ian Chen, Convert Me, Stephen Early, Eat Meal, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Apologia, Benjamin Simpson, Speed of Sound, our assistant researchers, Doronku, Totus Real, Christopher Johnson, our friend level, Daniel Bauman, Marigail Beddoes, Insects Are Cool, Kevin Miranda, Reeves, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Buffalo Lucas, Bo Holbo, Rasmussen, Alex Stone, Paul Williams, and I will continue to thank all of the legacy patrons, Jen, Jody, Mike, Don, Keith, Andrew, Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nana, Staggle, Sun, Sky, Stone, Ugly, German Truth, Everett, and Sewer. You all help out when you could. So, hello, Scott. So we got Scott, we got Slade, Lisa for Truth. Any questions that you want to put in? I am seeing the live chat along the side, and I'm happy to respond to all of that little fun and games on stuff. It's been an interesting week. There's been an awful lot of stuff in anti-evolutionism and creationism issues. There was a fellow that I was vaguely aware of on who has kept track of the various evangelical preachers who have been moving the goalposts regarding Donald Trump's inauguration that was supposed to have happened on January 20th and didn't. And it's a highly relevant issue on just how Looney Tunes, Kenneth Copeland, and various creationists are, that they functionally have been just simply denying reality. And maybe some of them are thinking that there's going to be like time travel going on to retroactively make Donald Trump still president for a second term. It's just absolutely ludicrous. One thing about, someone says turn off my ad blocker, but that's basically all I can afford to help out. Because of what I've been doing in this, I never had to worry about being monetized, and which means you never get ads here. You may have spotted that already, that there's never a thing where a couple minutes down the road, suddenly there's a bit for some stupid project that you really don't like at all, or that I wouldn't like. You see stuff that I'm sure Paula Gia wouldn't want to see on his videos, or Dapper Dino, or anybody else that is monetized in that way, and you got to do the little click to get past it. And sometimes they got the little hand up and hand down to whether or not you can comment whether you dislike it or not. But nope, you get me unadulterated without any adverts, because it's all completely user funded, and I'd like to keep it that way. I'm annoyed by the fact that here I'm watching a video and then there's some ad that comes along for a thing that really is completely discordant with what the video is about. I like to keep it clear on that. Lisa Fortune says, how do they explain the fact that all they can do is play defense on evolution? That is an interesting question, because I'll put you up there so we can see exactly what's going on there. They don't think they are playing defense on evolution. That if you look at your heavy hitters like Carter, that's why I encourage everyone, that everybody can go and read it on themselves, that they are utterly super confident that they have the evidence, that they're absolutely certain that their genetic entity is real, that they've got the genetic information down solid, and so forth. But as Dan Stern Cardinale and others have indicated, no, they don't have the data down. And if you get out in the outside world and start reading the regular genetic material, they're not paying any attention to Carter and Sanford and Jensen. And no, not at all. Tompkins. They're not being cited. Genetic entropy ain't a thing. Nobody's paying attention to it. No one's using it. It's non-existent. So you have to then look at how they're compartmentalizing their head to where they think of that's going on. And there's also the prospect that it's part of the apologetic bravado. That we know when Jackson and I made a big deal out of all the instances in which there are serious problems in creationist thinking that the creationists know about because they have gone out of their way to discuss them in their technical literature, but somehow that never gets filtered down to their general apologetic discussion. David, sure, RJ will appreciate those 2 pennies YouTube will give him. That's about um, and the Vestas is the only way that the 45 resident of the White House can become president again if he becomes the president of the prison glee club. That's a possibility, yes, or perhaps the president of Mordor, or some such. But anyway, um, the the mindset of the apologist is to downplay the problems. So we know that accelerated radioactive decay, flood forests, catastrophic plate tectonics, all of these things are seriously disputed inside the creationist community, but not in their overt apologetics discussion. So there's just no discouraging word when you get to the postings you find at Creation Ministries International and Institute for Creation Research and Answers in Genesis. Hello, Titan. We got the gang, and so far we got a smooth stream. I will call attention to the facts that there's the Rocks with their book and Evolution Slam Dunk, which I did solo on the reptile mammal transition. And if you like fiction, the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg, the first volume of that, I am now just in the process of having the attack upon the mysterious airship Helios in the wilds of South Africa in 1879. That's forming the climax section of the second Paralogs novel. And that I can do in the wee hours of the night. And the plot I actually had worked out quite precisely quite a few years ago. It's the execution to write it to be on a par with what the first book is. And also make it a completely fresh and vital and entertaining little medium. So this whole attack sequence that I'm doing is probably going to end up only about 3 pages long of text, but it's got to just run gangbusters, paragraph to line to line to line to make sure all of the things run smoothly. That's an aside. So the papers that I'll be putting up regarding the embryology material is really used to see as a guide for things. Both the 2006 paleontology paper, and of course, we've actually moved way beyond that in 2020, 2021. And likewise, the Kuratani-Erie paper from 2014 is a useful guideline to where the technical literature is, and it's not been any grand revolutions since then in 2021. All of those can be avenues for people to follow up on the research. So if you start looking at the source citations that are in those papers, you can follow up on those online. You can find out who's been discussing the work since then. And you can catch up to speed in a variety of different ways on that. So I encourage everybody, as a basic source methods rule, in any topic, not just what you're seeing on mine, it's a universal toolkit that if a technical reference is mentioned or a particular scientist in their work, even if they don't specifically cite a technical paper on it, you can Google the material, and I encourage people to do so. And that will allow you to get a grip as to where the person is in the field. You can often locate the technical literature that even if they didn't bother to mention where they are, and that's a further sign that there's a solid grounding in the work, the fact that you can do follow-up research like that. Whereas if you try to document somebody that's got their head up their ass, try to find the material on it. You discover that there isn't any. Slade, come here. RJ, you got the pointing to books down pat now. I had to do some practicing on that because I realized that in order to point to what is immense right behind me, I actually have to point towards the window, which is off that way. And so I'm not pointing at that at all. This is the Cinerama trick that people who made it, the old Cinerama 3-screen film process had to learn, because even what ends up on a curved screen isn't what you were photographing. So people that seem to look like they're looking at each other from the A and C frames aren't looking at each other at all when they were filming it. So they would have to have somebody standing way off off of the screen so nobody could see them with a great big pole a disc on it so that people could use those as sight lines. And exactly the same thing happens with this. And it's taken me a little bit of practice to figure out what the hell's going on it. I did learn the trick that if you have books, anytime you're doing a video, put your merch out. I see this on when anybody is doing Zoom interviews nowadays. You conveniently see their latest book and their Grammy Awards, if they're theatrical people, and so forth and so on, up so that you can see they have been done as their word. And, why not? You want to shill the product as best as possible. Lisa Virginia says, Hogan thinks we still use Haeckel's drawings. Yeah. Oh, and it's not just Hogan. Boy, that is a super duper trope that I pop up and bump into people almost daily where they're repeating these tropes. Often they're the same old creations that you're bumping into over and over again. There's oh gosh, I can't think of her name right off the bat. Bump into where she's still dragging in the Haeckel's drawings, but yeah, when you try to pin her down on source material, yeah, no. Leanne, I think her name is on. A brain bug. Hello, the YouTubes told me James Downard is live. Yes, the YouTubes were right. I figured out all the little sidebars about how to set up. The glitches that I had in the show early on with the new laptop was the fact that I wasn't setting up stream in advance. It turns out that Restream does a whole bunch of stuff if you set it up, hour and a half warning on it. So if I'm trying to set up a program, oops, one of your stream is having connection issues. Well, okay. If we're glitching up on there, let me know. The signal seems to be coming through on all of their. Brainbug, of course, is our go-to person for bugs and all the damn arthropods. I don't know whether or not you kind of expanded out to extinct arthropod groups, trilobites, and all funky little critters that dominated the show 500 million years ago that are gone from the field today. That's an interesting paleo issue. David H. I highly doubt most of creationist preachers actually think we use these arguments. It's just a selling point for they're already buying into their religion. Oh, don't be so sure, David. Don't be so sure. I proceed from the assumption that every anti-evolutionist standing for truth, yes, the R.J. Downer, can I get an autograph? Standing, you buy a copy of my book and mail it out to me, and I will be happy to sign it, and then make sure there's covered postage so I can send it back to you so that there will be no cost to me. You do that, and that's how you can get my autograph standing. Easy peasy. But there will be that hurdle to do, and you'll have the added benefit of reading something that is well documented, which is more than can be said for Raw Matt or you. Anyway, Old Scratch, yes, Haeckel's drawings were actually well done. Yeah, we have to remember that the infamous Haeckel's drawings, the one about the embryos, was just a light illustration in a book. It was not intended in a technical literature. As anybody that's actually studied a bit about Haeckel knows, that he was actually a quite meticulous draftsman, and there are people who have gone through and looked at the stuff like he would do on radiolarians, and that they're just meticulous drawings. This is not the chintzy little quickie drawings that were done for this particular book. And of course, it's an irrelevancy today because we've got microphotographs of the various embryos. The most that can be said is that Haeckel's chintzy little drawing for the book took some liberties with details. And he had a particular model of recapitulation. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that supposedly the embryos of organisms recapitulate the adult stages of their ancestors. Well, that was an idea that didn't catch on because it's wrong. And it's been routinely pointed out that it's wrong. And even the textbooks that would occasionally use some of Haeckel's drawings would call attention to this. And so this is a tempest in a teapot. Oh yes, I do have a stand. I do have a humor standing. I also get a guffaw out of reading stupid stuff and fact checking things. And I will say this: that standing, you're too low on the totem pole to get the big league laughter. The kind of humor that I've got from looking at David Minton's screw ups or Andrew Snelling's that we discuss in the said book, Rocks Were There, that Jackson and I have written. That stuff is really knee slapper stuff. You got to wonder at how anybody could have made the kinds of gobsmackingly stupid mistakes they would on their own source material. Andrew Snelling, we have caught him in the section on radiometric dating of exactly saying the opposite of what the content of the paper that he just cited said. And from my view, that's a knee slapper. That sound scholarship should be not amusing in the sense that it's talking about serious, rigorous ideas. But when somebody makes stupid statements, you may be gobsmacked at how dumb they are, but they're also terribly funny. And Brainbug, standing for truth, are you on camera now? I don't know. Brainbug did put, I'll put a little show that so people can call attention to that in the live chat there, the YouTube trilobites. They're an intriguing one to deal with that anybody that's interested in paleogenomics is going to want to think about, because you've got a whole group of organisms that existed as a very powerful, persistent group. And the reason why we have so much of them is because they molted. So what most of the trilobite fossil record isn't bodies of trilobites, it's the bodies of the molted shells of the trilobites. And so often these things are being done in groups where they're presumably meeting for whatever they know. They go through the big molting stage and run off and do their other little shtick. And all of that theoretically is being done by genetics, that there are dynamic processes going on in trilobites, but because there are no living ones, we can't tell what their genes were. David A says, reason why I doubt they believe evolutionists use the bad arguments is largely because they keep spouting the same ones none have used besides themselves, like we evolved from ox argument. Oh, but remember, David, that creationists are lazy. They're prone to parasitical secondary scholarship. I'm not guessing at this, I'm measuring it. That the vast majority of anti-evolutionists, particularly ones that you encounter online and in social media, have not bothered studying much of this beyond what they copy from a small number of sources that they don't fact check. So that's why you get the same tropes. We were just bumping in, who was in the T.D. Lane and I were independently bumping into a guy, Hawkins, who is apparently a Dwayne Gish era creationist. He has read and met Dwayne Gish and Henry Morris, and since they've been dead for 20 years, practically, we're talking about he must be an old fart like me. And he has no seeming understanding of creationism of the 21st century. So that's something you always have to pay attention to when dealing with anti-evolutionists, is where they're getting their material from. If, I will plug again, Evolution Slam Dunk, that will give you a clue about where people go if they're trying to discuss the reptile-mammal transition, because big chunks of that issue come from books written by anti-evolutionists versus the relatively small amount of material which the current crop of creationists have dumped into as well, which we're going to be mentioning in Rocks Volume 2. Don't worry, Standing for Truth, you're not going to be overlooked this time. And the same thing with Nephilim Free and the various comments that, Ian McLean, he took a pot shot at Evolution Slam Dunk. And there's newer material on this where they haven't added anything to the debate. All they've done is try to bring up some new pot shots. Lisa for Truth, if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Now, that one is one of those arguments that is, okay, where are we? There we go. That is one of the arguments that creationists warn other creationists not to say. That Answers in Genesis has put posts up of arguments that you shouldn't use, and that's one of them. And yet, I think anybody that's on social media has encountered example after example after example of people who keep repeating those things. Well, how come if human beings descended from apes, why are they there? Why haven't they turned into human beings too? And I describe that as the no cousins rule, that you can translate it very straightforwardly. If you read my older material at the TIP website, that I go into the details of what the no cousins rule is. Standing for Truth says, I got some short clips for you, RJ. I've been putting out just for you, Cam and all, arguments you'll have fun with. Probably not. Let me warn you, Standing, that you're not very original. And you're good at repeating the same thing over and over and over again, but you don't go after the core issues involved. We can't get you pinned down. And it's not just me, but Erica, Dan, Stern Cardinale, Dapper Dino, the whole everybody in the field can't manage to pin you down on matters of how you account for Jensen and Tompkins and others misrepresenting their source base, which we observe them doing. So anyway, the no cousins rule, yeah, old scratch. If I came from my grandparents, then why do I have cousins? All you have to do, to use the analogy of genealogy, is when you were born, did all of your cousins drop dead? No. Why should they? That's not how it works. Partly, one of the reasons why this trope persisted as long as it did is because of the notion that was the case in 19th century Darwinism, that the idea that all evolution occurred by species A gradually changing to the point where it's now species B, which means species A ain't there anymore. Well, that's what is called sympatric speciation. And while it occurs in nature occasionally, it's relatively rare, especially in vertebrates. And instead, there was a notion that Darwin himself recognized the idea of, but didn't pursue it very much in his writings back in the 1870s. But nonetheless, was the idea of what happens if a population expands its range wider and wider and wider? And can there be such variation between this version of the population and this version of the population that eventually this part might actually be deemed to be an entirely new species compared to this one? That is the sympatric speciation model. And that means that when B appears, A doesn't cease to exist. A is still there. And we can see this in rudimentary form with the idea of ring species, which is a branch of species that shift around the geographic range, where you have A and A interbreed with B, and B part will interbreed with C, and the C part will interbreed with D. If you try to breed A and D together, you'll find they won't interbreed. And then, therefore, by a species definition, they're separate species, even though they have an interconnecting grade of interbreedability. And that's because the zygotic isolation mechanisms, there's another little buzzword that you can go looking up. Zygotic isolation mechanisms. That has been studied probably most relentlessly in fruit flies. Oh, RJ is actually my dad, but he kicked me out of the house for being a white, so now I'm a rebel. Oh, Standing, that is so hilariously amusing that if you only realized how that's even more improbable than your young Earth creations. Oh, yes. For stand-up, probably this is not a good career for you to go into. I'm not sure that you're great on improvisation and all the rest, but anyway, give it a whack if you want to. You might stand a better chance at that than ever making any headway in persuading any non-creationists that you're right. Zygotic isolation mechanisms are really, and also known as pre-zygotic isolation mechanisms. It's been studied in great detail with Drosophila, the little fruit flies, because they breed really quick and they can maintain lots of different populations of them. And there's lots of different subspecies and species to deal with. So they can look at the fact that the processes whereby a population of organisms branches and forms zygotically isolated breeding populations is not a simple door, because you can remember you can have males and females that can either, the male of one can interbreed with the female of the other theoretically, and the female of one can interbreed with the male of the other group, and gradually it can reach the point where one of those might not work anymore. That's what we discover with mules and others in horses, and the same phenomenon goes on. It's a relatively slow process. Sometimes you can get speciation events occurring without any morphological change at all, just because a little pheromone switch clicked and the organisms, a population of the organisms start breeding at a different time of day. And at that, therefore, it doesn't matter how randy the ones that showed up 3 hours earlier are, or in the wrong season, they won't interbreed with them, even though physically they can, because they're operating at the wrong time. So there's a bunch of dynamics that go on all that. David, it says sounds entirely backwards of how events usually take place. Yeah, that's kind of how it sounds. And so the thing is that there is a huge literature on speciation processes, relatively slow process, which is why you don't see new species kicking in really, really quick. But if you think about how long the history of life has been, if speciation were really quick, we'd be seeing it much more readily than we do, which is a problem for creationist baraminology. Because remember, the baraminologists have the double bottleneck of the created kinds 6,000 years ago during the creation week, after which no new kinds were ever created. They're all from that block, which means that all of the organisms that are trapped in the flood, which is actually the whole fossil record, all those have to have originated from the created kinds 1,500 years earlier. Then those same created kinds are parked onto the ark. Uh-oh, now we got a problem because there's only a limited amount of room on the ark. So that puts a constraint on how many created kinds there could have been. And then the same created kinds that off of the ark then proliferate from the species that we see today. And again, we're talking about only about a 1,500-year period, because by the time you get down into historic times, people are mentioning drafts and all these other things. So they're making pictures of them and so forth. So you've got a reflection. So basically, you have a double whammy bottleneck, where you have to account for the fossil record occurring lickety-split and the existing species lickety-split from the same set of created kinds. Yeah, this is not an easy task to do, and you're finding the creationists can't get anywhere near this. It's a mess. And even in the Ark encounter, as I pointed out, there's at least 3 examples in the Ark encounter where they have just slipped in evolutionary ancestors for the created kinds. That's true for the giraffe example, and it's true for the whales, where they put a mesonicid or something up there, and also the dinohippus that they stick in as the created horse kind. And that, of course, is begging some questions as to why they stop at dinohippus and not going all the way back to Horacotherium, and that's a little side issue. And if you read the exciting Rocks Were There book, we go into all of that information in great detail. So, oh yeah, Standing, go on Lisa's show, have some discussion, and I will be delighted to watch to see what kind of discussions go on. He's appeared in without an avatar, without the SpongeBob avatar or the pseudo Superman avatar. He's actually done at least one video that I've seen where you actually get to see him. And if you are planning on not being completely anonymous, which there are people who like to remain anonymous and behind an avatar, but since you put your mug out there, go with it, kid. There's no going back. Just as Old Fart here has his mug out, I'm not making any secret about who I am, because I am what I am, like Popeye or God of Abraham, depending upon who wants to borrow the quote. I'll say to Lisa, all ideas worth having are one worth defending. So I'm always far more sanguine about people who are honest about their views and willing to defend them. And if you want a biblical analogy, Daniel going into the lion's den, and that flips both ways, by the way. So that a creationist appearing on a program discussing stuff with an evolutionist is one area, but same argument. So too is an evolutionist going on a show with creationists. And sometimes you can have perfectly fine discussions within those contexts. Others are not. Nephilim Free is somebody who wants to control the narrative and stonewall on issues as such that he's made me angry, and I've stomped out at a point. And that can occur when you get something where they're just hammering away on the point over and over and over again, and they're trying to get you on an apologetic line of reasoning to get you to where they want you to have, and you're not having a conversation at that point, so why bother? Old Scratch said they only need one single cell organism on the ark. There was plenty of room for that. Yeah, if all life on Earth is a monobaramin, that's another term you should probably know about, monobaromon. Monobaromons are when Wise came up with the structure of baromonology back in the late 1990s. He basically borrowed the terminology from paleontology because that's what his training was. He was a paleontologist, studied under Stephen Jay Gould. So there are poly phyletic, monophyletic, all these terms. He simply adapted the terminology that's used in standard systematics to the creationist context. And so what a baromon is a created kind, and a monobaromon is an evolved lineage within a created kind. And that's why when Wood and Kavanaugh and others decided around 2006, using their own little tools, that the horse sequence was a monobaromon, that's really important, because it meant that all of those horse sequence evolving characters are all within supposedly a bigger kind. Now, there are examples of tremendous confusion. You get things where some creationists will start suddenly switching from a monobaromon to a baromon without realizing they just gear shifted. And there was some example that we noted of that, of a creationist that apparently forgot what the terminology was within their own discipline. Yeah. David, it says, one thing I don't recall hearing about were cavemen and Neanderthals in the same branch but splitting like a near cousin, or were there more speciation events in between? The old caveman term, which and comes another term you hear is Cro-Magnon, which is really stuff that you would be reading in books from the 1950s earlier. You have to remember how little information was known. It was not at all clear in evolutionary thinking back in 1940 how Neanderthals fit into the picture. Were they cousins or were they ancestors of us? Now that we have a much more detailed record of just about everything, it's quite clear that Neanderthals branched off from the Homo erectus bunch before the group that eventually generated Homo sapiens down in Africa. So we're close cousins, close enough that we could interbreed. And exactly what direction that is, we don't know. It wasn't very necessarily often. The geneticists would have estimated that maybe there were about 100 boinkings taking place between Neanderthals and humans, and most all in the area of the Middle Eastern section, which was in a period when the remnant populations of Neanderthals were bumping into the spreading out of Homo sapiens and doing some things. Now, we don't know whether this was consensual or not, and whether it was female Neanderthal with male human or male Neanderthal with female human, and how that was going on. And there are also examples apparently of crossbreedings that were taking place where they were interacting down in Iberia, Spain area. There may be more beyond that. And remember, we got the third player here in the Denisovans that are in Central Asia. And there's even some genetic clues to suggest there's another group that we have found no fossil reference of at all yet, and may never. But nevertheless, there's just little snippets of that genetically. So what you probably got with the Homo erectus group is something, for those, let's go down memory lane to the big issue of out of Africa versus multi-regionalism. This was a really hot fistfight issue in human evolutionary thinking back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And that was, were the Homo erectus population a bunch of interbreeding population blobs that became multi-regionally specialized, and that we eventually started calling them Neanderthals and various others, and Homo sapiens? Or was there a relatively restricted population group in Homo sapiens that then went out of Africa and really have too much of an interaction? Well, it turns out both of those are pretty much right. And that is that you have multiple waves of Homo sapien and precursor populations spilling out of Africa, and regionalization variations that were taking place, and interbreeding issues going on. So both of the models both had relevant points to it. The our particular species definitely originates in Africa, spreads out, and gradually replaces just about everybody to the point of where eventually nobody else is standing except us. And so Neanderthals check out eventually, and if there were any little remnant populations, like that possibility of the little hobbit, the small possible Homo erectus remnant down there in Indonesia, my soft spot is that some of the stories of the wild men of the jungle type stuff that pop up, the Olmas legends and others, and the Abominable Snowman and various others, some of these may in fact relate to legitimate remnant populations that have survived of our hominid cousins that we didn't know what the hell to make of. But it's all highly speculative and largely legendary, because without the genetic and biological data and the fossil data, it's iffy. The romantic in me likes to think that that's possible. Old guys, I would totally consent to a Neanderthal so long as they had a good personality. Yeah, that's um, the it, it's it would make a difference one way or the other. Was it the case of consensual sex? Were there people or Neanderthals that were, ooh, wow, baby, look at those muscles, those brow ridges, wow, ooh, neat. And what was turning on various people? We know in our own human population there's a wide range of sexual interests, and it goes both heterosexual and homosexual, and you've got fetish interests and people that have interests in feet, and I'm sure there are people that are terribly interested in elbows or whatever, earlobes, whatever you have, somebody is going to be interested in. So the idea that over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, as populations interacted, there wouldn't be some examples of occasionally, but there may also have been examples of forcible rape. And so those are just as equally plausible examples that we know that takes place in human societies during wartime, all of that. So we can't tell from just the genetic data what the circumstances were, and even whether it was male to female, who was the female and who was the male. The information isn't clear enough to be able to indicate that. And since we're only talking about maybe 100 or so boinking episodes in the course of tens of thousands of years, yeah, that's a small data field to run off of. David, it seems some these days are much more related to Neanderthal anyway, so there's a strong possibility you could get your chance. Yeah. But we know as a white guy, the odds are, I've never had my DNA done, so I think it's a moot point from that point of view. But I would not be shocked. In fact, I would be surprised if it turned out that I didn't have a little smattering of a couple percentage points of Neanderthal DNA and maybe Denisovan DNA knocking around in me. Most people in Eurasia do. The groups that don't are ones that originated before that time. So it's relatively rare in African populations, except where people who have genes have interbred, again, through a variety of mechanisms, some not all consensual, that have mixed up the genetics. And so if you find some very rare areas, there are blocks of Africa populations that are so homogeneous that there don't seem to be any sign whatsoever of any Neanderthal haplotypes. And it's been a mixed bag for our species, because apparently there's some aspects that are positive, beneficial for immune systems and other things, and then there are other things that have mismatches that can lead to some potential disease problems in that. So it's an up and down kind of thing. BJ, my arthritis screams Neanderthal. Well, we'll see whether that's to do with that. The one thing we do know, however, is that the range of Neanderthal fossils and genetics means they are not our species. So the old argument that was the case, and you still find Rupi and Sanford and Jensen and all the others still trying to push this argument that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis are the same species, that Neanderthals are just mutant, odd, overly robust humans. Sorry, that was an argument that might have carried a little bit of weight 50 years ago. And there were even there was one guy, Goodman, I think, who was trying to push the idea of treating Neanderthals as a subspecies of humans, so it'd be Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. But now that we have more fossil data, and particularly juvenile fossils, that we know about tooth eruption patterns and jaw structures and suture patterns in the bones, They're just outside the human range. They're not the same. And we have the genetics. And so, sorry, that boat has sailed, and we're all out of it. Oh, but boop, boop. Hi, Lavender Lady. How you doing? Everybody has had various times ups and downs on things, and I was pointing out earlier, Lavender, Diane, that Jackson is under the weather. He's got some strep throat, and one of our people in the live chat has got the possibility of that. So, BJ Price, yes, and how fast they matured. I'll put a little call attention to that. Yeah, that's another factor, is that we've got information on the maturation rates and the features that are going on there. Physically, one of the things that I remember about the Neanderthals and why it seemed implausible that they could be the same species as ours is how incredibly difficult it is to make up a human to look like a Neanderthal. Now, they have to do it when they make movies in which human beings are playing Neanderthals. But what it means is they've got to put, the brow ridges and stuff, they got to do stuff to kind of conceal the fact that we have a chin that's very prominent. And you can make them look sort of Neanderthal-y, so that if you were to, they look different from humans. But the problem is that when they actually look at how they put appliances on, they can't really match well because our skull is shaped differently than Neanderthals are. And so they've just got pieces where it's stuff that we have to glue on to make it kind of fit more or less. But the rest of it doesn't balance at all. And we now have these examples of hybrid forms that are occurring. How many of those ended up as just isolated people and ending not contributing much to the regular genetic population? We don't know. We don't have every single fossil that ever existed. Nobody important says, have you read the Anthro comic books by Howie Post? They are not scientifically historically accurate, but they're funny. No, I have not. They're this will become as an absolute shock to you. I do not know everything. And comic books and that are ones that are an interesting little side area. There's a whole slew of the various illustrated high-end comic books that have been made into various films and all that. I knew about them as a genre, but I haven't followed them. So the short answer to that is no, and probably never will. David, it's just need a hell of a good makeup artist to make up people look like skeletons. Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways and tricks and trades that you do. And so nowadays, when they tend to do documentaries on Neanderthals, they go CGI. And so that means they don't have to worry about putting on appliances. They can physically make the Neanderthals and animate them so that their bodies are shaped the way the Neanderthals are, their proportions are correct, the skull structure is absolutely correct, and they can then just have a human being doing the motion capture. So they got a little green balls all over their body, like doing Gollum in Lord of the Rings. And you can do the same trick with that. So there was a documentary series that was done on where a bunch of paleoanthropologists and geneticists and others were putting their input in on Neanderthal evolution. And I think it was about a couple of years ago. And they also had documentary on how motion capture. And so that's a whole new tool that gets onto there, and we can kind of move beyond the material that was the case older. One thing I will tell any person diving into this area, whether they're a creationist or an evolutionist, be careful about not relying on old sources. And by old, it depends on the area you're dealing with. If you're trying to discuss geology and it's before 1980, then probably you're in trouble because plate tectonics has revolutionized the field too much. If you're talking about genetics, anything before 1995 is increasingly put question marks around it because of the development of homeobox genes and all that. That was only being worked out in the mid 1990s on. So that's another little benchmark. Paleontology, if you're talking bird evolution, boy, if you're looking at stuff before 1995, you're missing a huge block of data field. And in fact, stuff even from before 2005 is often redundant and unnecessary because the field has advanced so quickly. So you better keep track of stuff. And you can do it in a variety of ways. You can do it by Google searching stuff. You can do it by just keeping your eyeball peeled. I keep on recommending to everybody Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, as pnas.org. Boop, boop, boop. That's open access. Well, let me, whoops. I hate it when I start typing on something and yet my keyboard is not there. It's not actually typing anywhere. There we go. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.org. That's the website for it's every week that they come out with a new issue, and lots of it is open access even at the get-go, but all of it open access after a year. And that is a useful litmus test for your familiarity with any field. It doesn't have paleontology papers every week. It doesn't have particular technical. Most of it's on detailed genetics and all sorts of stuff, so you can scan through an awful lot of the material and not bother about it. But it's also a way of gauging how much you understand the scientific venue. If you can go through a Proceedings of the National Academy of Science table of contents, and most of it might as well be written in Klingon, that you have not the foggiest idea what they're talking about, don't dive into science discussions because that's a measure of it. And I know that from my own experience, that gradually you have to learn to get a sense of what the terminology refers to, even just from the title of the paper. And it just dive in. If you find a particular topic that interests you, then proceed and follow those. Now, you can also do the same trick with science and nature. Those, however, are behind firewalls. If you got the money to subscribe to science and nature, well, go right ahead. Or check also to see how much of it's available online, because an awful lot of it does get posted online. And check your local library. That you can gain access to hard copies or PDF versions of papers in most major libraries if they operate anything like the ones we have in Spokane. And if you also have colleges in your area, pay a visit to their library. That even when you are not a student, they still are a library access, and you won't be able to check a book out, but you can still go into the stacks and you can research and do all sorts of stuff that way. And believe me, they will be happy to help you. If they're anything at all like the university that I'm at and the various universities that we've interacted with. So don't be shy. Um, um, David says, so someone like me should not even bother with that link due to lack of proper understanding of anything. Science fan here, not scientist. Well, don't be intimidated by it, David, because it's a way you can go into the wading pool. I mean, no one's going to chew your head off if you go into the technical, see what the abstracts are, and look at them and go, do I understand this or not? And if you're dealing with a particular subject matter, then you can start homing in on it a little bit more. And also, if you do it on a regular basis, you start becoming familiar with things. Oh, another area that's really useful is when there is a controversy. If you have a thing where comment, Schmidlap paper, and then Jones comes up and goes, Schmidlap declared such and so. We disagree sharply. And there's a reply by Schmidlap et al. Saying, well, no, we dealt with that, blah, blah, blah. Those controversy back and forth, and you find them at Science and Nature as well now and then, is an instant recognition of a potential controversy area, but also is letting you open up the hood of the scientific mind to see what issues they're bringing up and what levels of evidence they're talking about and how they're arguing over stuff. So theoretically, the paper reached a peer reviewed where an awful lot was settled just to get the paper printed. That doesn't necessarily mean no one's going to be disagreeing with it. And in certain controversial areas, you do get back and forths going on these. And these are also useful ways to see how the scientific method runs. Old Scratch says you can look up the terminology too. Oh, that is so neat. Yes, I mean, don't be worried about that. Words, every discipline has specialized terminology. It's as true for hip hop and musicians as it is for lawyers, as it is for scientists, as it is for auto mechanics. Every discipline, every field of life has specialized tools and terminology and traditions. And there's always the tendency to want to do the secret handshake and to try to make it feel like it's more mysterious than it really is, but it isn't. Everything that is being discussed in any area, you're to find an explanation of it somewhere. You can Google, and there's some pundit that will want to explain the thing. Oh, Lisa for Truth, if you get published in Nature, you've arrived. Yes, pretty much. And oh, BJ says, I need to learn to explain it to a Pentecostal friend. Yeah, it's basic source methods. You can do it by, heck, cajole them into watching the show sometime and putting up questions. If they're not terrified, have them come into the show and we can have a chat about it, methods issues, because this ain't rocket science, even though rocket science makes use of it, and it shouldn't intimidate people. I am not a scientist by training. I have a BA in history, and I am using exactly the same tools that I learned for researching and source checking when I was dealing with 19th century history, as I do in any other field. And so and also shameless plugs for the books, that those are applied source methods, seeing exactly how the operation go. And I think I may be having a stream. Lisa for Truth, I will say, don't. Wikipedia is useful in its own context. It's not a destination. I don't use Wikipedia as a destination. It, however, is a perfectly good launchpad, and it will tell you a lot. I use it as a measuring stick. For example, I hear about some brand new paleontology find, and so I look it up on Wikipedia, and I find there's nothing on it. Well, that shows you that that's really new. It hasn't even hit publication yet. It hasn't been described properly. There's not even any controversy over it. It's just basically whoop, out there, and it'll probably eventually get there. So Wikipedia is a useful measuring stick and a listing of source material, but I never regard it as an end destination. I don't treat it as an oracle. I don't assume everything on it is absolutely perfect and accurate. Mistakes can be made, or it can be superficial, or they could have missed something that's relevant. But it's still a useful little time saver, that you can find out a lot about an area, that can save you basic research issues. Just don't treat it as a universal thing. BJ's check sources in Wikipedia as well. It's good for that. Yeah, they've got direct links. Sometimes they're to secondary source material. That's always a concern. Sometimes it's to primary source that you don't have direct access to. So, for example, I find this a lot in talking about a lot of mythology and history material, relating to the ancient world, is the books are and journals aren't necessarily open access. There are ways around that, which is side issues. But oh, BJ says, I learned to use the simple English option in Wiki. Learned a lot about crinoids. Two, another thing you may remember is, if you're worried about how much paper you need to print out, there is an option in the menu, save as PDF. And you can save their document file as a PDF, and then you can now look around at it. You can do text search in it. You can, the hyperlinks won't work, obviously, but you can still print up only the pages that you find relevant. I've done that a lot, where there's some Wikipedia listings that are like 30 pages long. I'm not going to print all of that up. I'm not made of ink. But I can save it as a PDF, and then I can print up the relevant information, and then I can access what I need whenever I want, because it's saved as a PDF. So those are all just some of the little tricks you tinker with. There's also international Wikipedias that may or may not be in anything remotely English, that can sometimes have stuff that's not available in the English language version. So there's a lot of different ways around it. But as I said, no, I don't dump on Wikipedia. I just don't treat it as an oracle. But boy, it's a perfectly fine gateway, the gateway to information. But always fact check the stuff. And it gives you nice biographical information on people. I don't think I have a listing yet on there, although I do. I think I popped up as a reference to something in relation to the reptile mammal transition. And I think paralogs of Phileas Fogg is mentioned in relation to Jules Verne. So Google Translate and hope for the best. Yeah, I've made use of various translation mediums for the novel, because occasionally I have people speaking in foreign languages, and I want to have kind of a sense of what they would have originally said and it's all very, very handy. So there's a bunch of tools out there. Don't feel intimidated by them. It's an exciting world. It's much easier to do research today if you have proper tools and methods than it was when I was 20 years old, scouting around in the college libraries, basically on your own. And we now have access to such a staggering amount of information that therefore there is no excuse for ignorance, not in 2021. The only reason why somebody would be ignorant of something is because they relied on bad sources, and that goes back to the source methods issue. That yeah, they got a foot. This guy who was the Dwayne Gish groupie I asked him point blank, did he bother to fact check Dwayne Gish's book? Well, I fact check a lot of Dwayne Gish's stuff, not only in my old postings at the TIP website, but also in Evolution Slam Dunk. I went into great detail for a lot of the stupid that Dwayne Gish did by directly looking at his primary sources. And he was really evasive about that. He honestly thought that because Gish had references, that they were well referenced. The mere presence of a footnote was somehow indication that it was solid. Nope. Even idiots can put footnotes in and misrepresent sources. So the mere presence of a footnote, even lots and lots and lots of them, is no indication that they're reliable with it, which of course is the point of our other cute little book, The Rocks Are There, where Jackson Weed and I have gone into the primary source documentation that are being presented by Answers in Genesis, among others. And it's a contact sport. Source methods is not for the squeamish, because it's if you're pushed out of shape by small print and obscure little things and how things are spelled and all the other things to track down, it can be very intimidating. But if you got the inclination for it, it's really powerful tool. Because my contention is that people who really have bad reasoning practices cannot do sound source methods. They just screw up on it. So if you force them onto that turf, they're just going to implode because they're never going to be able to play that game. We're just been on for a whole hour. Anybody got any last minute? Lisa for Truth says BS in psychology here. Bravo. And that's too much of the cognitive literature area is almost invisible in the anti-evolution literature, and that's why people who have an expertise in that area should dive into that critical area, because it's a turf that needs to be documented even better. And congratulations, I've received 100 messages today with Restream chat. Isn't that sweet? Oh, Old Scratch says, have you heard the creationist now saying that the Earth of Evolution says that an octopus and a squid came to Earth via meteor? Oh, yeah. That's an incredibly stupid paper that somehow managed to make it into a relatively minor journal. I know Rick Ramasinghe, the guy that was with Fred Hoyle, was one of the co-authors of it. And so they were arguing that cephalopods supposedly had a genome that was so weird that it could only have come somehow or other from like panspermia, outer space-ish. It's a very badly argued argument. And I don't have the name of the technical paper right off the bat. It got a huge flap, and it may actually have been withdrawn. I think there was a flap that was so big over it that there was an effort to actually get it withdrawn. But I know Chandra Ramasinghe, I will attempt to spell that correctly. Chandra Ramasinghe. I think that's how he spells it. And Lisa says, do you have a hundred of supercontinents in rocks? We only, in volume 1, we only discussed a tad about supercontinent issue. Rocks volume 2, flood geology sections in the second volume is going to be going into that in quite a bit of detail, which is actually a good thing because we know so much more about it. We've got what we do know is you've got Pangea, which is the most recent supercontinent, and that's sometimes spelled with an AEA and sometimes with an EA. It depends on what country you're in. Before that was Rodinia. And now we're back into Precambrian times, way before. And then before that, Columbia, and there's also mention to Nuna and a couple others, because when we get that far back, um, you're now having so little data field to play with that trying to figure out all of the players involved and to give names to them is harder and harder. There is a brand new paper that's come out which has reconstructed the plate movements for the last billion years. And that one is just a brand new technical work, and we'll be alluding to that in rocks too. The reason why the supercontinent issue comes up in the flood geology context is because suppose you've got a divide. If you look at the Dwayne Gish era creationists, Avesta says PC Myers did a video of those nutters. They're almost as fringe as flat earthers. Uh, the Dwayne Gish era creationists of the 1970s denied plate tectonics and continental drift completely. Absolutely. Didn't think there was any evidence for it. By the time you hit the 1990s, it's becoming really obvious that that's wrong. And so you find the newer generation of creationists have accepted plate tectonics and continental drift movement, but there's still a murkiness about what was going on. Now, if you go to the Creation Museum in Kentucky, their model is that the pre-flood world was Rodinia. They're really up to date. And then there was a rapid rearrangement into Pangaea at around the time of the flood or immediately after. And then it settled into the world we now know as our continental distribution in a time frame of some indeterminate vagueness. Now, that's an awful lot of stuff to cram together in such a short time frame of just a few years. There you go. Not all creationists follow into that line. So if anybody says in the creationist movement that Pangaea was the pre-flood world, they're probably not following off of AIG's stuff. If they think of Rodinia as the supercontinent that was pre-flood, then they're probably ripping off of the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum. So there's a variety of little litmus tests that's popping along in here, and all of those are absolute claptrap. So, scratch, just in case I've missed it, when the show is finally posted, put a link in, make a comment on the video, and put a link in for the public people to be able to see once the thing is posted on that PC Myers video. I think that would be kind of a neat little thing to put a little reference into that. So make a point of putting that up. I may already have that in my reference base. If not, I'm curious to see what it was. So that's the advantage of connection. So I'm putting it on you, old scratch. There we go. So we're past the hour. I don't see any more questions in that knocking along. And everybody stay safe. We're still up in the air because there are weird nutballs and stuff going around doing stupid things. We want to get back into normal. And oh, we got some new messages down there. What we got? Oh, yeah, time twins. Yes, we'll be in 10 days. We'll be the same age. So we'll be time twins again. Isn't that nice? We'll see you next week. There's going to be much more discussions of stuff going on, and I guesstimate when people have asked about it that we should probably be diving in come the spring to the full-blown writing on the Rocks Were There Volume 2, which will probably be about as bulky as the Rocks Were There Volume 1. And anybody that wants to buy a copy of it and ship to me for me to autograph, and I will ship back to them, I'm open to that. Hear that, standing for truth. Okay. Rodinia. Ben Daly says, was that continent during one of the snowball Earths? Yes, that was the one that was occurring around that period. And it was in a different, I suppose I'm going to go over here because it's such an interesting issue, is when you think about it, remember the Pangaea supercontinent went pole to pole. So you had a huge panthalassa. If you imagine all of the present continents crammed together, wedged, although it was starting to break up to where, like a zipper opening up, the North Atlantic opens up before the South Atlantic does, things like that. But it's basically North Pole to South Pole. And that's a different dynamic than a supercontinent that is arranged equatorially and in one hemisphere versus the other. So the climate impact of that on the planet is, by definition, has got to be different. If you have a thing where you're using those Milankovitch cycles that switch back and forth, where you have lots of land in the northern hemisphere and lots of land in the south, but you've got a lot of big ocean around there, and it runs pole to pole. But that's a different dynamic than one where things are arranged along the equator. The Rodinia supercontinent was largely in the southern hemisphere, as I remember. And by the time you get to the Cambrian period, big blocks of stuff that are now in the northern hemisphere were still along the equator, on the beachfront property down in the tropics. That was true of all three of the big Lagerstätten deposits from the Cambrian, from the Sirius Passet in Greenland, Xinjiang in China, and the Burgess Shale from British Columbia. All of that was in the southern hemisphere in the equatorial zone and on this big landmass. There were other parts and other land masses knocking around up in the northern hemisphere that were smaller, but the bigger blob of landmass was basically parked around the South Pole. And so that must have had a different dynamic in terms of climate than we get with a pole-to-pole approach that we get with Pangaea. Columbia, I don't think quite as much is known about how many pieces there are fitting into that. Now, there are other terms that pop up. Holtzgeist, thank you. Rodinia is for spelling. It's my understanding, I've always seen it spelled without the H. Rodinia, like that. And whether or not there's some people that do it with the other version. The only one that I've seen variation is Pangaea, which is sometimes spelled without the A and sometimes with the A, like that. And I think Brits tend to stick the extra A in there because they just see hoity-toity and they do it that way. But I think American geologists often do it the other way. And you find this with an awful lot of terms. There are things, there are geologic deposits where there are multiple different spellings for the same damn thing. And that means you have to be very careful about doing Google search and stuff on things. And remember, creationists like to play word games. So creationists will use polystrate fossils and terms like that that aren't used by the regular sciences. So if you Google them, you're going to get a pile of creationist postings rather than the science work that discusses it, because they don't use the word polystrate fossil. So those are all the little ins and outs of stuff that you'll learn. So anyway, we're past the hour on here. We're degenerating into chaos over supercontinents. Color versus color, exactly right, David. And we will see you all next week. Everybody stay careful and have fun and learn, because the universe is really interesting and time is fleeting, and we want to find out all we can and avoid being a nuisance. So see you all next week, gang.